Thank you. Welcome to you all to this evening's event, Q&A for Ask a Funeral Director. This event is hosted by Poppies. I'm sure most of you know Poppies, but for any of you who don't, we are a modern independent funeral directors. We pride ourselves on putting our clients at the heart of everything that we do and being extremely flexible and bending over backwards to help them have the funeral that is meaningful for them. We also pride ourselves on our transparency in a sector that isn't renowned for being open about pricing and about cost. We are very confident and proud of the way in which we are able to talk about our costs and the prices that we charge our clients for a service that we think is outstanding. And then the other way we think we are different from many other funeral directors is that we feel very passionately about the need to reduce our environmental footprint in a sector that has a very, very heavy environmental impact. And we're working hard at Poppies to do that, both as a business and with supporting our clients to make more environmentally conscious choices. My name is Claire Montague, and I have the honour to be Chief Operating Officer at Poppies, and I am also moderating the event tonight. So it is a Q&A session. I'll just say a bit about how we're going to work before I ask the panellists to introduce themselves. So we have a Q&A function on Zoom, and that's how you can best ask questions. We've had some questions that have been submitted already, so thank you to anyone who's done that. And if you want to raise questions in the meeting, please use the Q&A function in Zoom in the bottom right hand corner. Well, not quite bottom right hand corner, because the bottom right hand corner is to leave, but the one next to that. You feel free to use the chat function, but I won't be monitoring it for questions, so use it to network, get into a debate, but for questions, please do submit in the Q&A button in the right hand corner of the screen. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be putting it on YouTube for people who have said that they would love to have come but couldn't make it this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to start by asking my lovely fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Amy. Do you want to say a bit about who you are?
Great, thank you so much, Claire. Yes, hello everyone, I'm Amy. I'm really humbled to have been asked to do this, and I'm really excited to be here tonight. I'm a funeral director here at Poppies, and I've been doing this role for almost 3 years now. Before this, I actually had a background doing community projects and youth work, so this was a very new environment for me. But Poppy and Aaron definitely showed me the way, and it's just been an incredible experience. My role here is to really guide families to create that funeral that they want and need, and I help them through all the planning stages, and I'm also there on the day with them, and then afterwards for anything that they need as well. So thanks for being here, and I'm really excited to get answering questions, really. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you. Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie, and I'm a Celebrant trained and accredited by Humanist UK. I'm self-employed, but I work as part of the funeral directors team. Usually I'm contacted once the client has chosen their funeral director and booked their funeral in. And then I meet the client and work closely with them to craft a funeral that is all about the person who died. I spent several months working at Poppies as a funeral director, and my father died during that time. It meant a great deal to me that I was able to help collect his body, and that I knew he was being well looked after in Poppies' beautiful mortuary before the funeral took place. I want to thank Poppies for inviting me to join the panel today. I'm looking forward to answering any questions you might have about the work of a celebrant.
Lovely, thank you, Natalie. And talking of mortuary, Aaron.
Hi there, my name's Aaron. I am the mortuary manager here at Poppies. Came into the funeral industry quite fresh-faced about 5 years ago now. Previous jobs were in the greyhound and motorsport racing industry, so completely different. It's my job and our logistics leads, Neil. Our main focus is the care of everyone from collection to the day of the funeral.
Lovely, thank you. So I've got a first question, which I suspect actually might be for you, Aaron, but it might also be for you, Amy. So do you want to start, Aaron? This is from Louise. My friend would like to be cremated and then sent up in a firework. Is this possible? Aaron, do you want to start?
Completely possible. As are most things, you know, if you look into it, you can probably do it if it's legal.
If it's legal.
But yes, there's such a vast array of things, meaningful things that you can do with people's ashes these days. So well worth looking into, or talking to a funeral director who might have some more information.
Do you remember what the most unusual thing anyone's asked you to do with their ashes, or has said that they want to do with their ashes? Have a think and maybe come back to you on that. Have a think on that. Amy, do you want to chip in on that?
Sure, yeah. So there's a great website that's actually just a brilliant resource in general called Scattering Ashes. You can go on there and they've got an array of how to turn your person into a firework, and you can even have a 5-minute display. But honestly, just if sort of going on from what Aaron was saying, if you were to put it in Google, there are loads of different options, and you can also send your person pretty much into space as well, and you get this really beautiful video of the ashes being released and then sort of beautifully falling to earth, and it's wonderful. So yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do out there with ashes these days.
Good to know, thank you. So we've had a number of questions from Cam and from Louise again about washing someone and about visiting someone after they've died. So I'm going to give you a couple of related questions. So Louise asks, I'm aware that once my loved one is in the care of the funeral director, I can visit them in the chapel of rest. But if I wanted to travel with them to the funeral home and take part in the washing of the body, this final act of love, would this be possible? And Cam says she was really pleased with the service that you gave us when her dad passed away in October 2020. And for a simple cremation, would we be able to visit the deceased in the chapel of rest and would be allowed to dress them for the cremation? So that's about visiting, washing and dressing. And again, Aaron, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. So you can definitely follow us back here to Poppies. You can help us check your person in, you know, every step of the way. You can be as involved as much as you would like. Definitely dressing, washing. I've spent quite a few hours in our friends and family room helping families dress and wash someone, and it's a great thing to do.
Lovely, thank you. Anyone want to add to that? Or should we move on? We've got a great question about embalming. We'll move on just from asking questions of Aaron, but there's a great question on embalming, and I know that embalming is always one of the most interesting subjects when we write about it on our blog. So Lisa asks, when my brother-in-law died, he was embalmed, but not everywhere. His hands were stiff like a doll's, and he was very weird looking, and his fingers were poker straight, but then his arms looked withered. So we assumed that the main area of his arms hadn't been embalmed. And why would this be? His face looked fine, but other areas just looked strange. Do you want to pick that up, Aaron? And perhaps talk a bit more about embalming and what you do and don't need to do.
So to start off with, you certainly don't need to be embalmed. It's something I didn't realise before starting at Poppies. I just assumed that that was the natural thing. You died, you were embalmed, and so forth. But no, embalming is definitely something that doesn't need to happen. As for the question, not being a trained embalmer, I couldn't give a scientific reason behind why that is, but it's certainly one of many reasons that we don't embalm at Poppies and we go for natural death care, because sometimes the results aren't what you hope for. Sometimes it can be sold as a fix, embalming, but it's not always the case. And I do feel some families aren't explained enough what it can turn out like, or the whole process in general.
Do you find that, Amy, that people come to you asking for embalming or assuming that people need to be embalmed?
Completely. And I think actually sometimes people find this sort of amazing calmness that their person doesn't have to be sort of touched anymore, if you like. Sometimes they've come from a hospital environment and they've already had a lot of invasive procedures, and actually just knowing that their person can be with us and can be washed and they can have their hair washed and they can just be left alone is actually just a real comfort. I've definitely also had hospitals say, oh no, you can't possibly see your person, you know, they've not been embalmed yet. And you know, on one occasion there was someone that had scoliosis, and I think that they were worried that the sort of position that her sister was in would almost scare her. So when we received her into our care, you know, we put just a new nightgown onto her as we were requested to do so by the family. And I just spoke through what her sister looked like, and she went in and saw her, spent time with her, came out and just said, I'm so glad that I saw her as I knew her. This is what she looked like. I know that she has that curve in her spine, and she hadn't been sort of straightened out, if you like, which is definitely sometimes what can happen when people are embalmed. And she just looked sort of normal and natural. And I think sometimes a lot of the comments are, my person was embalmed and I almost felt like I didn't know them. They looked, you know, very full, or maybe they'd even, you know, had their hair dyed, or they'd had makeup on that just didn't even look like them. So actually, I think sometimes people with all the best intentions can feel like they're wanting to protect someone by not letting you see that person, or by saying embalming is mandatory. But actually, when you explain in neutral, factual language how someone is looking, it can just be so empowering, and it can just be a really great relief for people to see their person as they know them.
Lovely, thank you. I think that's going to take us on quite nicely to a question that Yen asks in the Q&A, which is, can you tell me the sequence of events after someone has died? And they say, as a doula present, who is responsible for removing drips, etc.? And obviously it will slightly depend on the circumstances and where someone has died. But Erin, do you want to pick that up? Because you and your team start off with collecting people from the place that they've died.
Yeah, so the first one being rigor mortis usually kicks in pretty quickly within the first couple of hours. Completely person dependent, it can last for a couple of hours or it can last for a couple of days. Body itself, where the heart's not pumping any longer, the blood isn't flowing around, so you get something called lividity, where you might notice where someone's laid down on a bed, the back of their head, their neck, along their back area will start to change colour, it'll go to like a red, where everything's just starting to sit. They would be the main. And where the bacteria starts off in the stomach area, you'll notice a greenish tint would start. They would be the most common things that I would say someone would see.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to move on to natural burial, because we've had a few questions about natural burial and what you, if you want to go for a natural burial option, what you need. So there's a question about urns and a question about natural fibre clothing. So Louise asks, if I'm cremated but wish to be laid to rest in a wetland burial site, does the urn have to be made of a biodegradable material? And if so, what material you would recommend? And Teresa in the Q&A is saying, where can you find natural fibre clothing to be buried in for natural burial? So do you want to start with that, Amy or Erin? Who's best? Erin, you're open.
Yeah, Amy would be the best one for that.
Thanks, Erin. Sure, I mean, yes, so a really good example is we have an acorn urn on our website, and that is essentially made of paper. So that's really nice and biodegradable, and it comes with a cotton bag inside. Anything unvarnished wood, that's always a really nice option as well. To be honest, you actually don't even have to have anything. You can absolutely just sprinkle straight into the hole, which is a super natural approach. There really is, as far as I'm aware, you know, some places might require, but definitely some places I know don't. So it's just sort of finding, you know, bamboo is now also on the market. And then in terms of finding natural fibres to be buried in, I mean, cotton, wool, those sorts of things are all really good. There's a lovely lady called Yuli who has a company called Bella Couche, and she, and other companies are available, I'm sure, but she does really lovely natural woolen shrouds as well. So you might not even really want to wear clothes, you might just want to be placed into a shroud. Erin, I know that that's your option of choice. They are super cozy, or just, you know, wrapped in a cotton material. So, you know, it's basic and it's kind of plain, but I would say those are probably the ones. I mean, Natalie, is there anything that's kind of springing to your mind?
I was just going to say that actually the natural burial grounds themselves are possibly the best source of this information, and they do have their own individual specifications, don't they, as to what they will and won't accept. So if you've already chosen your plot, which is a great thing to do in advance, then you can speak to the owners and managers of that natural burial ground and find out exactly what they do and don't allow, and that's probably the very best thing to do.
I think while we're on the subject, Lottie asks, are wicker and cardboard coffins really that environmentally friendly? Amy?
Oh my gosh, I love this question, thank you. You know what, this is a really hard and good question to answer. You know, just to be really transparent, we're working really hard to make sure that our options are eco-friendly and that people understand what that really means. So actually, as it happens, we currently import our cardboard coffins from Ireland and I think sometimes historically Poland. So I think it depends on the carbon footprint as well. The materials that they're made from might be environmentally friendly, but the sort of footprint that surrounds them, where they've come from, how they've been produced, might not be. Wicker, you know, again, it really depends where it's come from, you know, as I'm sure you can imagine, things can be imported from China, but there are some really beautiful companies in the UK that home grow the willow and home weave the willow. And there's definitely a company in Devon that you can go to and you can weave your own coffin. That is what a beautiful experience. I mean, I don't know really where you'd keep that. I'm sure it would make a brilliant coffee table or blanket storage unit for the time being. But yeah, there are some great options, but it's definitely worth really looking into, is this actually an eco-friendly product, and pushing the funeral director for questions, you know, with questions and getting them to answer them. So yeah, great question, thank you.
So that's great, thank you. We've got a number of questions from, I think we've got a lot of celebrants here tonight, so thank you celebrants for coming. And a number of celebrants are asking a range of questions around how you get in with an FD and how you get onto an FD's books. And Jill has said, as a newly qualified celebrant, my question is, what would give you the confidence to give a new celebrant their first ceremony? So I wondered first if, Amy, you could answer that from the perspective of the funeral director, and then maybe Natalie, you could talk a bit about your experience as a celebrant getting in with FDs and how that's worked. Amy, do you want to start?
Great, thank you. Yes, so it's really hard. We definitely have a lot of celebrants that come to us and say, oh my goodness, you know, another funeral director has really pushed me down on prices, or, you know, I perhaps don't feel that I can show my true personality. And I think I'm just going to speak from a Poppy's perspective here, that we love it when funeral directors come to us and say, this is me.
Celebrants come to us. I mean, we love other funeral directors too, but we really love celebrants.
Sorry. Oh my gosh, good catch. Thank you, Claire. Thank you. So I can trust Claire to pick up and catch me there. Sorry about that. Yeah, totally. We love it when other celebrants come to us and they, you know, they really kind of present themselves as, this is me, this is what I can bring, that's something a bit different. I definitely know that we are looking for celebrants that are a culture add rather than a culture fit, to make sure that we can really match the sort of client base that we work with. You know, we can't just end up with all of our celebrants being the same. And also, sort of in fairness, it will really affect the sort of workflow as well. So, I mean, from a Poppy's perspective, I would definitely say, don't be afraid to show something a little bit unique or different. Yeah, I think that would probably be my main tip. Natalie, I'm sure you've got tons to say, so please jump in.
I think, so yes, I would say Poppy's is quite unusual. In common with a very small number of smaller funeral directors, modern funeral directors, Poppies does try to match the celebrant with the family. I'm sure you're all aware, you know, so many funeral directors out there, it's kind of one size fits all, and they're not paying the same level of attention to matching people up and making sure that each client gets exactly what they need. So so as Amy says, it's, you know, having a personality and being an individual is not seen as a bad thing when you work for Poppies, which is wonderful. I think probably the first couple of funerals that I did for Poppies as a celebrant, I brought 2 Poppies, and I would say that's probably the best thing of all, really. Occasionally, I'm sure you get clients contacting you directly, possibly before they've even started looking at funeral directors. And if you have a funeral director that you want to work with, then that obviously you can make that introduction. Clearly, you know, you're going to want to be discerning about that. And right from the very start, I had no doubts at all about introducing people to Poppies, because I knew the ethos, because Poppy is very much a kind of front woman for modern funeral directors. So I already knew of her before I ever did a funeral for Poppies. But yeah, I'd say that's definitely a really good way of doing things. The clients come to you, you introduce them to the funeral director, you work well with the funeral director, they get to see you on the day, and hopefully it goes from there. One other thing I'd add about Poppies, which does make them quite different, is that they always sit in on funerals. And I know that there are quite a lot of celebrants out there, and we all know that there are not many funeral directors who do that. It always does, I always do wonder, well, how on earth do you know whether to recommend me again if you haven't actually seen me in action? But Poppies are different, and they always sit in, and that gives them the confidence to recommend you to the next family that you might be suited to.
Yeah, go on, crack on, Amy.
Sorry, thank you. That's actually just reminded me of something. Also, I think maybe you don't necessarily need to be so apologetic about being new to the scene as well. It's okay if you're new. That's great. We were new. I've never been a funeral director before, and I learned on the job. And I think it's totally fine to sort of not be apologetic about that as well. And you I don't know, it's up to you how much you want to disclose, but I think sometimes celebrants do come to us and naturally they're very nervous, and it's really hard to sort of gauge then what they might be like. So, you know, we definitely do have an open door, but definitely don't feel apologetic about being new either. Yeah, good luck. I'm sure you'll be great.
Thank you. So moving away from celebrants, and we're now on to renting a coffin. This is a really interesting question from Michael, who says, why can't bereaved families just hire a coffin with the body, and then with the body just taken out to be cremated? It would save money and waste. Have you ever come across that, Amy?
Absolutely not, but it sounds absolutely genius. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question, apart from it's a brilliant idea and maybe you should start doing it.
I mean, maybe it might be worth talking a bit about how families and people who come to you make choices for coffins anyway, because there's also, while that is also a phenomenal, environmentally friendly rent a coffin idea, it may, for some people who come to you, feel like they want their person in a coffin from beginning to end and not one that they've just sort of taken off the shelf, as it were. Do you want to talk a bit about what it's like when people come and choose coffins?
Yeah, totally. So actually quite a lot of the time we have, you know, Aunt Sue would have loved to have been popped in a cardboard coffin, but we can't possibly have that because, you know, Aunt Margaret would just be absolutely furious about that. So there's often, you know, a sort of slight misalignment. So if you really, really want a cardboard coffin, or you want a coffin that you think might not be in line or are sort of acceptable with family choices, it's a really hard one, but I'd just say try and tell people as much as you can to make sure they honour that choice. You know, again, there's lots of different choices out there, from cardboard, willow, bamboo, and then you've got the really big American caskets as well. So it's a hard one, but again, maybe thinking about, you know, well, was that person particularly environmentally friendly minded, sort of open-minded. Might this be in line with what they might want? Might we want something that we can decorate ourselves? That's always really nice, and I'm sure Natalie's got lots of things to kind of share on that. You know, might we want to take this cardboard coffin home and spend time decorating it? I know a family of ours recently did that and had it pedalled through London, which was fantastic. And then all the children and all the family gathered around. They spent a week decorating it and sort of, you know, covering it with love. So, you know, I suppose, what does the coffin mean to you? What does the coffin mean to the person that's died? How might you use the coffin? All of those things sort of might come into play. I hope that sort of answers the question. I'm sure Natalie can add to this. I'd love to hear. I feel like she's desperate to contribute. Please do.
Oh, yeah, just really to follow on from what you were saying about decorating coffins, that's also something that you can do during the funeral itself. So a plain coffin can be decorated with ribbons, with tags, with messages written on them, with things placed on top or woven into the handles, with photographs stuck on the sides, messages, cards. And that can be a really nice thing to do during the funeral itself. It kind of demystifies the whole thing of the coffin and brings everybody together around it. Sadly, over the last couple of years, with COVID regulations fluctuating, we've been a little bit more limited in those sorts of options, but I'm really pleased that we're going to be getting back to being able to do things like approaching the coffin, spending time around it during the service, because I think that's a really valuable thing for people to be able to do.
That's brilliant. There are two questions that I could take from that. I think one is going to be around Alex. I'm going to pick up on the personalizing the coffin, because Alex asks, what are some of the simplest ways to personalize a funeral? So having talked a bit about decorating coffins, what are the other simple, not necessarily expensive ways that you've come across of personalizing funerals? So should we start with Natalie and then go on to Amy? And Aaron, if you can think of anything that's happened in the mortuary, I'll come on to you later. So start with you, Natalie.
Gosh, I would say use a celebrant, to be honest. What can I say? I mean, that is absolutely the job. It's making every funeral personal, individual, unique, tailored to the family, tailored to the person who's died. So I think, you know, so the words that are used, the music that's chosen, photographs that might be on display, those are the basic nuts and bolts of a funeral ceremony these days. And every one of those things can be personalized completely. And then you can move on to things like the choice of coffin, or a ritual of some description during the ceremony itself, like lighting candles, or passing a favourite possession around from one person to another, or all holding hands and singing a song. It can be a religious song, or it doesn't have to be a religious song, a favourite song. Just everything about that time that you're spending in the chapel could and you know, in my view, should be totally unique and totally personal. So yeah, and doing that and creating something which is completely tailored to you is really powerful and healing part of the process of coming to terms with somebody's death. So I would really strongly recommend that you work with whoever is doing the funeral for you. That's the funeral director and your celebrant or minister, to make sure that everything you do in that half hour or hour is tailored to you.
Thank you. Amy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think making a funeral personal is a really kind of personal opinion thing. It's really sort of, it means so many different things to so many different people. And I've had families that have just put some music on in the background for the half an hour that they chose to have. And as Natalie actually sort of said, they've just passed around photos, and actually they've just sort of huddled together and not necessarily even sat down and used the chairs. They've made it a very sort of informal space, which I know isn't always possible at every crematorium or cemetery, but they made it their own, and it was very relaxed. And actually I've even had some families that have just listened to music and sat in silence for the time that they've been there, and that's been really powerful and personal for them to just be alone with their own reflections. But I suppose on the real flip sort of side of that, we've definitely had a couple of funerals recently where they've said, can we do a can-can whilst bringing in the coffin? Yes, you can. Sorry, that was dreadful, but it's actually really quite hard to do. But they did definitely attempt it, and you know that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to really make it a celebration. We've had a family that found an oud player, and that was just so beautiful. And the person was playing the oud whilst someone was singing, and it was just so deeply beautiful and moving. And then, you know, people saying personal poems. And actually, I know I'm sort of going on quite a list here, but there's just so much. If you don't know what to say, I've definitely had people read bits, you know, a paragraph from a favourite book that they read together at a book club, or perhaps by that person's bedside. You know, children reading a little bit from a book that they shared with Nanny that they loved so much. All these kind of just lovely things that happen. And, you know, as Natalie said, you know, flowers can be a really big part of a ceremony as well. Going up and placing a flower in a coffin is something quite often that people really like to do. It's sort of a gentle, natural thing, a way of interacting that doesn't kind of require too much, perhaps. But yeah, I guess the kind of the options are infinite. And really, I think what people should know is that time in the service space is yours, however you want to spend it. You don't even need to use a crematorium chapel or a cemetery chapel if you don't want to. Now, more and more spaces are sort of, you know, neutral spaces, bars, and kind of event spaces, perhaps I should say, are allowing people to hold funeral services there. And that can feel so right for them as well. So yeah, the possibilities are endless. If you've got questions afterwards, you can call us tomorrow and speak about them more. But thanks.
Lovely. And Erin, what's your experience of sort of personalisation in the mortuary? I guess particularly when people come and visit.
Yeah, so when people come to visit, it could be quite simple things from either writing something inside or on top of the coffin, or placing personal items or items that remind them of that person. So even down to something simple like their favourite chocolate, putting a bar of that in their pocket. You know, it's nice little simple touches like that.
Lovely. Which actually takes me on to Jane's got a couple of questions. We're back onto natural burial, but since you were talking about objects in the coffin, Jane asks, can you put objects in the coffin for natural burials? And are woodland burial sites nearby? So can you put, Erin first and then Amy.
So you certainly can put items into coffins. Again, it goes back to each burial site will have their own regulations as to what types of things can be placed into a coffin, what they will and won't allow, just like ashes.
Lovely. And Amy, there are some memorial, natural burial grounds nearby, aren't there?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's not sort of many in, or really any inside of London that we're aware of. Sorry. There's definitely sort of Eden Valley, which is sort of down sort of Surrey way, and then there's even further down sort of Brighton way there. Or actually, sorry, there's Clarendon Wood, which isn't too far. Then there's Clayton Wood as well, which I believe is more kind of Brighton way. So all kind of beautiful places. More and more they are popping up, and actually even cemeteries in London now are starting to do natural burial areas, which is a kind of new and different option, and might provide something a bit more sort of local if you are London based, but more and more they're definitely popping up.
Great, thank you. And a couple of questions we have. So Teresa again is asking about whether you can have, so this is about the sort of ceremony. Can you have a church service, the God bit, and then have a celebrant at the burial site? And Jane is also asking, can you sort of do memorial services and parties so that you have a very simple funeral and then celebrate life later when it's a bit less painful? So again, do you want to start, Amy, and then you perhaps chip in, Natalie?
Yeah, totally. So absolutely. Oh my goodness. So I've just had a really beautiful, very simple, kind of very, very close family and friends burial today at a cemetery, and then they were having a church service after that, directly after, and then they're going on to, I guess, what you might call a wake after the church service. So they sort of did things in a slightly different order. You can absolutely do things entirely separately as well. So you can certainly have a cremation or burial, and then, you know, a sort of infinite amount of time later, whenever you feel is best and right for you, have a memorial service. Commonly, people like to wait for perhaps someone's ashes to be ready, and then they might have someone's ashes at the service. Including religion is entirely up to you. There are civil celebrants that will, that are sort of maybe a bit more of a hybrid, that will include perhaps more religion. But I certainly know, and Natalie will definitely say, that even humanist celebrants will sort of cue in a prayer or cue in a hymn if you want. So it's really entirely up to you how much of a blend of religion or not you want. But Natalie, please, you know, let everyone know.
Yes, thanks, Amy. Yeah, I would agree really that you can definitely kind of split elements of the funeral or celebration up and have them on different days in different locations according to who's attending and, you know, when and how it's all going to work best for you. Certainly, I've supported a number of families where they have had a simple cremation, as Poppies would term it, so an unattended or very scantily attended cremation itself. And then on a different day, subsequently, they've had what is in effect the funeral, because it's the gathering of everybody coming together to remember the person's life. And of course, if you want to do the ashes in a firework, then that's going to have to happen a little bit after the cremation itself. And that would be quite possibly that would be your funeral in effect. But similarly, if you want to scatter ashes or cast ashes off a boat on the Thames, that's something you do later. And yeah, lots of families find that works for them for various different reasons. In terms of religious content or otherwise, I'm sure, you know, most celebrants would be happy to work alongside a priest in terms of you know, if a priest was going to do a service for one part of the family or the friendship group or whatever, that they would be more than happy to do a separate service. And as Amy says, civil celebrants might be very happy to do a kind of blended funeral as well, with elements of religion and non-religion all included at the time. So yeah, it's very much up to you. And I think the really key thing is to think carefully about what matters to you as a family, what the person's values and own worldview or religious perspective were, and try to honour those, and don't be rushed into making decisions that you have got time. You can take a little bit of time and work out what you want to do and get it right. And a good funeral director will be absolutely patient and supportive of you in making those sorts of decisions and guide you along the way.
That's really, that actually takes you, the thing you were talking about ashes being scattered on the Thames. I'm picking up Pat's question. Can ashes be scattered everywhere? While you're there, Natalie, do you want to let Pat know? Can you scatter ashes, sorry, everywhere?
There are some limits, some restrictions. So there are some waterways where there are sections that are privately owned or restricted in some way for environmental reasons. But generally speaking, I know the Thames, there's a blanket acceptance of scattering ashes. And at the seaside, you can do that. You just need to be a little bit careful about scattering on any kind of area where there might be environmental considerations, because ashes are not completely environmentally neutral. And obviously, if everyone were to do it in one place or another, then it would have an impact on local soil. And so you need to think a little bit carefully. If it's private land, absolutely you need to get permission, unless it's your private land. But if it's the Thames, then that's a really good place for doing it. Although I'm always relieved when people say that they would like to use a water urn rather than actually scattering ashes on the Thames, because there is a little bit of potential there for things to not quite go as you might hope on the day.
Do you want to explain briefly what a water urn is? Because people might not have come across that.
No, I don't suppose they would have done. But in fact, the company that we talked about earlier that does the fireworks, they're also a well-known national provider of these things called water urns, which are biodegradable. I think they must have a kind of air bubble element to them inside the urn itself. So the ashes would be placed in there, and then perhaps when you're on a little boat on the Thames or from a jetty or pier, you can cast the entire urn containing the ashes onto the water, and it'll remain on the water for a few minutes, and then just very gently sink in. The urn itself will degrade relatively rapidly, and the ashes are released onto the bed of the river or waterway.
Fabulous, thank you. So this is quite a pertinent question, since today is the day that all restrictions end on COVID in England. Tracy says that she's had an email from bereavement services in my area basically saying back to business as usual next week. And she asks, are there any changes that were made during the restrictions that you would like to keep? And I know particularly for, well, all three of you working for Poppies during COVID times, and it wasn't always easy. Is there anything that good that has come out of that? Or are we all pleased to see the back of COVID restrictions? Natalie, sorry, go ahead.
Well, my one is, it's sort of, I don't know, it wasn't a restriction, but it was something that changed very rapidly, and it was the timing was incredibly fortuitous, but the widespread introduction of live streaming of funerals, which was kind of already in train but happening quite slowly, suddenly sped up, so that I mean, I think virtually every, if not every, crematorium setting that Poppies was using has a live streaming facility now. Most of them also have large screens on which you can show slides during a service. And it's really not that long ago that neither of those two things were available, and they really bring a great deal to a service. So particularly when people haven't been able to travel during COVID times, the fact that they were able to tune into a funeral over the internet was just incredibly valuable and quite powerful, really, linking up people across the planet to say goodbye to somebody. So I'm really glad that that's happened.
Amy, do you have anything to add on that? Is that most of your experience too?
I totally agree with Natalie, for sure. I mean, something that really, a sort of unexpected thing that came out of it all was that some families and some people said, actually, I am finding this really liberating, that my options are very limited, because actually it means that this person can have the simple funeral that they really wanted. They didn't want like a big funeral that probably we would have had there not have been the restrictions in place. I definitely know there were a good number of people that said that, and just kind of, yeah, again, I guess it's just that sort of simplicity, being forced into the simplicity, and then they were definitely going to be planning a memorial at a later stage. I think that was just sort of an unexpected positive that came out of it for some people. But in all honesty, I'm really glad that now the numbers are opening back up again, because it was hard and it was heartbreaking. And I think a lot of people were sitting there thinking, oh, funeral directors are having a great time, but actually it was dreadful, and it was just, well, the worst. So I don't ever want to go back there.
Erin, I assume you'd echo that. Yours was a world of PPE and
yeah, so certainly one thing I hated from the restrictions is the pressure it put on people that couldn't see their loved one, couldn't visit them. I mean, so proud of Poppies and so glad to have been part of Poppies during the pandemic, where we were still letting families come in to see people who they potentially hadn't been allowed to see in a hospital or hospice for weeks or months on end. So glad to have been involved in that. Definitely what I would love to keep is how some doctors and coroners' paperwork has been made a hell of a lot easier to get hold of, and quicker, a bit quicker process-wise.
Yes, and anyone who isn't in this sector, that won't quite resonate as much as it will with anyone who's in this sector, but it is the most extraordinary paperwork heavy, and literally paperwork heavy kind of process for around registering a death, and so that is clearly something that's improved. Great, thank you. So Kate's got a question, and I know not everyone has been in this sector for 10 years, but really for as long as you've been around. Kate asks,
How have you seen changes in the last 10 years in the relationships between yourselves and clients, I guess in the time that you've been doing your job, in the way that people talk about and approach death? Is there a rise in pre-death bookings, which I think for us would be the funeral plans that we recently launched, so we haven't got a huge number of those. And related to this, are we all getting better at talking about death, for example, with death cafes? Aaron, you're already on, you haven't managed to mute yourself, so I'm going to come to you first. Have you noticed a change since you are our longest serving member of staff? You've been at Poppies 5 years. Have you noticed a change in that period about how people talk about death?
There's certainly more going on, and certainly more people are starting to realise that it's a talk that we can have, and it's okay to have. You know, in fact, it's better to have. So things like death cafes, certainly more of them have been popular. More blogs like our own, Talking Death. More things like that. It's definitely something we all need in the industry, I think.
Yeah. So Amy, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I suppose, you know, I really agree with Aaron. There's also Coffin Club as well, which has started up. The grief cafes are a brilliant thing. You know, I suppose more and more gradually it feels to me like there are sort of grief support charities as well, like the Good Grief Trust, that are sort of trying to engage people, and Dying Matters Week as well, trying to sort of bring those conversations into people's homes. So yeah, I guess I'm quite a newbie to the scene, but I do think gradually more and more people are warming up to this subject. I'm sure that's
it's long overdue, isn't it? Natalie, what's your sense?
I don't know. Yes, I mean, Amy's absolutely right. There are lots of these new kind of forums and ways of discussing death with each other. I think one unfortunate side effect of the pandemic has been that death suddenly got removed from us again. It was happening in closed hospitals where we were unable to visit relatives, and I think that's a terrible shame and has had some long-term impacts on people. And I you know, I'm very, very glad that that spell is over, and I would love to see, it might sound a bit weird, but I would love to see more people dying at home than has been the case over the last couple of years. And I see sometimes that gets reported as a very negative statistic in the press. I've seen a couple of things recently saying the numbers of people dying at home has increased dramatically quite recently, and partly that's not for good reasons. It's because of the strain on our emergency services and hospital services. But there may also be instances in which that's a good and a positive choice. And I think it would be great to see, you know, more people dying at home, because in fact, when you ask people, it's what most people want for themselves and for their own family members.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Lovely. Right, moving on to an anonymous question. How do you know you're burying the right person? Aaron, do you want to start with that? I think this is actually a really common fear, actually. I've heard this on more than one occasion, along with someone might jump out of the coffin. How do you know you're burying the right person?
We 100% know we're burying the right person because of the amount of checks that we go through, from when we collect someone, making sure, obviously, if it's from a hospital or hospice, you've got relevant paperwork, relevant release forms that confirm the identity. When they come into our care, we make sure that there's a name tag with every person with their details on. The funeral directors, I'm sure Amy will tell you, go through checks on the day. So before leaving Poppies, Amy would go into the mortuary, she would check that it's the right person, they have all their current possessions with them, anything that's been left with them is still with them, and important check that there's no pacemaker if it's a cremation. So yeah, definitely checks all along the way. Good.
So always burying the right person. But I think another myth-busting question that's come our way that I think is one for you, Amy, is what happens at a cremation after the curtains close?
Oh my goodness, this is one of my favourite things to answer, because actually it's one of the things I definitely did not know. Even at my dad's cremation, I definitely pictured him going behind that curtain, going immediately into the flames, if you like, and being cremated.
But actually, this answer might be a bit of a sort of come down. Nothing happens. The closing of the curtains or the moving away of the coffin is just symbolic. Some people really feel like the closing of the curtains is what they need to just kind of signify the end of the service, that they will soon be leaving. And for some people, they kind of feel like they're not just leaving their person there. You know, the curtains are closed and that's it, and they leave. But the reality is, once they've left, I know at quite a lot of crematoriums, they will bring in a trolley and move the coffin onto a trolley and move it into an entirely separate room. At some crematoriums, it goes almost onto kind of like a little lift and then it will go down. In other crematoriums, the whole kind of platform that the coffin is on goes into the floor, down into the crematory room below. In some, it will just kind of trundle through, you know, into a separate room. So there's quite a lot of different options, and that is because crematoriums are generally quite old buildings, and they don't have the infrastructure to have a sort of cremator right then and there, and also it's far too hot. It's not safe to have a cremator then and there ready for someone to just push into. There's an immense amount of heat that comes out of that. So yes, I suppose that kind of debunks that myth, perhaps.
Do you want to talk just very briefly, because we've got to wind up soon, about what happens with the various checks that the crematorium attendants do on someone? Because I think there's not only a thing about not burying the wrong person,
yeah,
there's a huge amount of checking, because I think one of the myths is also that you might get the wrong ashes. Yeah. And so what happens when you're behind the scenes? If you want to say very briefly to reassure people that actually the crematoria have really got a handle on who's been cremated at any one point in time, and that the ashes you get are your person's.
Yeah, definitely, thank you. I was actually talking to the chapel attendant at West Norwood just to definitely make sure I was getting my facts straight about this, that they create something called an order to cremate, and that stays with, so the coffin will arrive at the crematorium, they will bring out this piece of paper, check to make sure that the name matches with that on the coffin, and then it will go into the crematorium, people will have their service, they'll then move it into the crematory space, and they'll put it on the cremator itself, like an ID, so you know exactly who's in there. So they move the coffin into the cremator, they'll have their time in there, they'll bring out the bones and anything that's left, because they take away metals and anything that hasn't cremated. They take the bones and anything else that needs to be to the cremulator, and they take that form there as well. Once they've been through the cremulator, they'll take the form and everything and make ready to put in the urn. So there's a few different stages, and this form stays every stage, and then there's just another sort of identification sticker that gets put on the urn, and the form is checked against that sticker as well. So it's one person at a time. It's thoroughly cleaned out, and there's a really rigorous sort of, you know, flow of checks along the way that happen. So it's definitely just one person at a time, and definitely your person.
Good, that's lovely, thank you. On that note, I'm just going to wind up by asking each of you one thing you wish everyone would know about your job and about this sector that we haven't covered tonight. So I think I'm going to start with you, Natalie.
I would say the one thing I wish people knew was that there's no rush to have somebody who's died taken away to a funeral director. There is often a slightly kind of false impression that as soon as somebody's died, their body needs to be removed immediately, but it can be a really valuable, helpful experience to spend some time with the person before the funeral director comes. I've personal experience of this and stayed with my dad for several hours and then helped transfer him to Poppies, and it's kind of part of the acceptance process of coming to terms with the fact that the person has died, and it can be really beautiful and meaningful and memorable, and I wish more people had the opportunity to do that.
Lovely, thank you. Aaron, what do you wish everyone knew?
More about involvement. So how much you can be involved in all parts of the process, whether that be from on a home collection. I hear too many stories on a home collection of where funeral directors have told people to leave the room when they're taking someone. If they tell you to leave the room, tell them to leave the room and call a different funeral director, because you don't need to. You can be involved as much as you want, whether that be from collection, coming back, helping to check your person in the poppies. We've had families do that, dressing, washing, placing someone into a coffin, driving your vehicle as a hearse. You know, you can be so much more involved than you realise.
Very wise words. And Amy, what do you wish everyone knew?
I really wish people knew how much of a gift it is to leave any type of indication as to what you would like for your funeral. I have just seen it not often enough, or not as often as I would like, but a lot of people just say, I'll be dead, I don't care, do whatever you want. And that's fine, and that's true, but if you care for the people that you are leaving behind, please leave them the gift of, this is what I would like for my funeral, even if it's just one thing. This is what I'd like for my coffin. This is what I'd like for to be played, a piece of music. I'd like to be buried or cremated. Simple things can make the world of difference when your person is sad and grieving for you, and really overcome with a lot of emotion and, quite frankly, a lot of admin. It's probably the worst time in someone's life to be arranging a funeral. It almost feels cruel that you have all this extra admin when someone dies. So please write down and leave your wishes somewhere that you tell people about as well. Make sure people know where your wishes are. It's just a gift, a really, really wonderful gift.
Lovely, thank you. So thank you all of you. And thank you those of you who've come along this evening. We're just about to put up a couple of polls, and I'd really like it if you could just answer the quickfire questions, just so we can understand the impact of the event tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but do stay in touch with us. We have a newsletter, we have social media, we have a regular blog, and it's full of links are going to go up in the chat. And we regularly cover these kinds of topics in our blog and in our social posts. So please keep in touch with us. We do groups, talks like this for specific groups. So if you've got a group, a community group or a sector you'd like us to come and talk to, please do get in touch with us. And again, details will all be on the chat. And I think it all just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed for coming. Have a very good rest of the evening. Good night.